The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Intrinsic versus Inherent Value. So last month it would have been the beginning of this month, you would have seen it, but it was in December that I went to London and I debated Glenn Scrivener on Justin Brierley's Unbelievable show. Although I think that one had a slightly different name. He does a bunch of stuff, but you'll be able to find it. And it was the first video for January's Patreon project. It's just not hosted on my YouTube channel. So you'll have to dig around Patreon, which is, I suppose, a good time to remind people that if you like content like this and feel like supporting it, you can become a patron as well, but there'll be a tag at the end of the video for that. We discussed morality, and through the course of this discussion, we focused on more of a utilitarian approach. It's not that Glenn was in any way arguing that God necessarily exists or that God is required for morality, but that you have to have some sort of foundation and that God serves as that foundation. So it was a much more utilitarian approach. I'm going to do a debate review of that probably next month. And the reason I'm waiting is because right after the debate was over, Glenn evidently went through the debate and posted a video about 4 contradictions that I apparently made during the debate. So I want to review that, and it's worthwhile, but I'm not going to get into a dueling YouTube videos because I care more about the discussion. And one of the curious things that happened is on more than one occasion, my position has been misrepresented, and I'm not going to say intentionally, perhaps there was misunderstanding, perhaps I didn't communicate very effectively, by both Justin Brierley, who hosted that, and Glenn Scrivener, who was my interlocutor for that. And a lot of it came down to this notion of value, because I've said many times, and during that debate, that humans don't have intrinsic value. And I often say that expecting it to lead to the discussion in one direction, and it doesn't. Inevitably, people get their hackles up. And so what happened afterwards was Justin had said that it's a shame that Matt won't affirm that humans are deserving of respect or should be treated as if they have value. And that struck me as odd because my explanation already covered that. So we'll do that. But I want to deal with this issue of intrinsic value versus inherent value. I'm not, I promise, never in any of these discussions, I'm not trying to be overly pedantic or picky. I'm trying to be clear. And I thought that's where it was going. And clearly that's not where we ended up. So let's take a look at intrinsic versus inherent value. So my understanding and my usage for intrinsic means that this is a property of the thing we're talking about, that it is a part of it. It is part of its makeup, essentially, that it doesn't require any external influence or anything like that. I would prefer to say that humans may have inherent value, because inherent is different from intrinsic. From my perspective, as far as I can tell, there is no value without a valuer. And so nothing has intrinsic value to me. There may be other things that are intrinsic to everything, but not value, because value is something that we imbue an item with, or imbrue if you prefer. We desire things. And so you could say, do human beings have intrinsic value? No. Do they have intrinsic desirability? No. It's not that there's a property of humans that make them desirable. It is a property of humans and thinking creatures that we desire things, and we desire them to different amounts. We place different value on them in different situations. The money in my wallet doesn't have intrinsic value. But I would never say that it doesn't have value. That's absurd. And anybody who came at me, if I said, oh, the money in my wallet has no intrinsic value, do you think any of these apologists that I've engaged with would come back and say, oh, Matt doesn't think money has value? No, they wouldn't, which means, or at least I suspect they wouldn't, which means that on some level I suspect that they think that they're engaged in some kind of gotcha without really looking at it. Money doesn't have intrinsic value. Gold doesn't have intrinsic value. These are things where we have some cherishment or some desire for a particular thing, which can change based on the situation. If you have a glass of water and a hunk of gold and you're dying of thirst, that glass of water is probably going to be more valuable to you than the hunk of gold, unless you have some way of, trading that for the water, which you might if there was somebody else around. But if there's nobody else around, then the only value that matters at that point is you. You're the only mind that is valuing something. Hang on, that's not fair because we have a market value for gold. Yeah, because we live in a cooperative society and we understand that by and large, anyone can value anything. Things are worth whatever people will pay for them. But we make sure that people aren't being exploited. It's not like, oh, do you value your life or this glass of water? You know, I'm going to take your water at the risk of your life. We make sure that there's a standard. Here's kind of what we would expect the market value of this to be. And there are things where we can't put a figure on it, where we can't quantify it. Like, what's the value of a human life, even at the norm? I don't know. There's going to be a subjective assessment about how valuable somebody's life is that each person's going to have to make. And I can tell you that my life is more valuable to me than yours is most of the time. There may be situations where your life might ultimately be more valuable to me than my own. You never know. The situations change. It depends on what scope you were wanting to talk about. When I use a chess example quite often for morality, so we'll stick with chess. The pieces on the board, from the grand scope of the universe, from the cosmos, they have no intrinsic value, just like everything else. They have nothing has any intrinsic value. But if you stop your investigation at the scope of the chess game, do the pieces then have intrinsic value relative to that system? Perhaps, because the rules of the game dictate certain advantages and disadvantages of different pieces. But that's also situational within the bounds of that. We could say that at the scope we are discussing, the pieces have some intrinsic value. But at a global scope, we'd have to recognize that they don't have an intrinsic value. And rather than doing that and adding to confusion, I just prefer to say they don't have an intrinsic value. What they may have is an inherent value, or perhaps a good word for it would be a systemic value. That gold has some systemic value on Earth between humans. It's fixed and manipulated and subject to abuse, but there's still some value there because of the system that we're in. That's the difference. Does something have intrinsic value? No. Value requires a valuer, and that's going to change with the situation. But it's curious that we don't tend to have these arguments when we talk about other things. When we talk about money. The paper in my wallet is currency that is meant to represent something. In this case, it's fiat currency. So it doesn't represent anything other than what we've declared that it represents. And yet, even that has a value. It has value to us. It has value to keep you alive because of the system that you're in. So fiat currency has systemic value. Take that dollar bill, take that peso, take that pound, that euro, and try to give to somebody who is not a part of that system for that particular unit of currency. And who knows if they're going to value it at all. It depends on whether or not they're looking at the bigger picture of international trade. It's not a problem. The whole concern with morality that came up in this debate with Glenn was, oh, if human beings don't have intrinsic value, then they have no value and they have no guarantee that anybody's, cares about them or should care about them. And the should is what they're trying to get to. But as I acknowledged, I do value human life. My own, other people's less, maybe other people's more so at different times. That's the only value that's needed. The fear here on the part of the theist is that if we acknowledge that there's no intrinsic value, then somehow it'll all fall apart. You have no way to guarantee that one person is going to care about another person. And as I pointed out during the debate, and I will again in the full review, that objection, like every other objection against a secular moral system, is not in any way solved by appealing to a God, whether a God exists or not. Because if you're going to say that human beings have intrinsic value because they're valuable to God, that's not intrinsic value. That is another agent, fictional or otherwise, imbuing those human beings with value. And then you would have to be saying, well, God's mind can't change about how much he values humans. Well, depending on which religion we're talking about, how much God values humans is subject to a lot of discussion. But it doesn't fix the problem. And even if there were a God who defined human beings with a particular value, that doesn't do anything to convince someone who doesn't share that belief that they should value humans as well. So this objection that with a secular moral system, you just have no grounding, isn't solved by pointing to a God. And this was we did a little play acting sort of near the end of the debate, where I was pointing out that if somebody doesn't accept your foundation, there's nothing you're going to be able to do to convince them, where they couldn't just sit there and keep going, I don't accept that. Maybe there is a God, and God values human beings at $5 billion. I don't care. Why would I care what God values humans as? I am the agent who is going to value things based on my own experience, based on my own desires, based on the environment that I find myself in. The thing that protects this systemic value is the system, not appealing to something outside of it. The reason my dollar has value is not because Matt thinks it has value. It's because it has value to all of the people who are participating in that system. And that's the way life is. We share space with other human beings. The things that you do affect my life. The things that I do can affect your life. You have to take that into consideration. It's a cooperative thing. It's not a zero-sum game. It doesn't require some external manipulator to say, oh, you now have value. That we say we have value is what matters. And so when Justin went on Twitter to suggest that, so many humanists would say that humans are deserving of respect and we should treat them as if they have value, and he wishes that I would say that, I've said it many different ways over many different years. It's a cornerstone of humanist views. This is what humanism is founded on, and I've been advocating for humanism for 15 to 20 years almost. It's funny, though, that I had this conversation. All I did was point out that humans don't have an intrinsic value, that value requires an agent who values something and has some desire, that it is subjective, that it is situational, and everything seemed to fall apart in their head of, oh my gosh, if you accept that, it's no absolute, and I wish you would say this. So, okay, I'll say it. I think we should treat humans as if they have value. I'm even fine with you saying we should treat humans as if they have intrinsic value. They don't, but treating them as if they do is the same thing as treating them as if they have inherent value, or treating them as if they have value. Of course, people should be viewed with respect. One of the weird critiques that came in that I didn't have a chance to really dig on was somebody on Twitter who was basically just pronounced me an idiot and said I needed to study history and philosophy because my views were dangerous. How is that in any way a rebuttal? I agree. Those views are dangerous. That doesn't change whether or not they're true. It doesn't change whether or not I'm right about value. The danger, though, doesn't come from me pointing out that humans don't have intrinsic value and that gold doesn't have intrinsic value. The danger is in the religious advocates suggesting that if we don't accept a religious doctrine, that will erode value and the entire system will fall apart. The danger is coming from the people who are setting up false expectations and false requirements about value, not from the people who are saying, you know what? I'm a human being. I matter to me. The people around me matter to me. I value them. I value me. We have to interact. And in much the same way that my currency has value, even if it's just because we said it had value, human beings have value. And curiously, it's not just because we say so. It's because that's who we are. That is the substrate of our interactions. And unless you're living off on a planet or planetoid by yourself, interacting with nobody, this issue of value is pretty much intuitive, and it permeates everything you're going to do. So if you're engaged with apologists and you simply point out something like, this doesn't have intrinsic value, and they seem to lose it and suggest that you've uttered something that's going to end and destroy the world, make sure you point out that it's their biases and their religious teachings and their false premises that are causing the problems. Recognizing the truth about value, that it's something we do, can't be dangerous, or it can't be any more dangerous than any other truth. Seems we've gotten along fine, even when people disagree about religions, by acknowledging you have value because you have value to you, because you have value to me, because you have value within the system. What more could you want? What more can you need? What more could you possibly show? And this is why theists like Glenn aren't arguing for the existence of God. They're arguing for the usefulness of the God concept because it fills this void. It solves this problem. A problem that it doesn't solve, and a problem that is created by the false expectations of their religious doctrine. See you next time. Bye-bye.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.